Hello and welcome to another episode of the Able to Care podcast. I'm your host, Andy Baker, and joining me as usual is my co-host, Nadine Sutton.
Hello.
Hello. A little bit different again this time. We've gone back to kind of an old format. We've been trying to get more people involved with lived experience in our podcasts. But this time we're going to be talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And one of the things we found really challenging with this is getting people with lived experience to come and engage in this particular session. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we're going through, because I think it's completely understandable. In some ways, it's a bit of a shame. I think both of us encountered individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder within our working lives. And it's one of the areas that a lot of people don't understand. There's a lot of people who haven't even heard of it. And I think, again, like all of the stuff that we talk about, kind of reducing stigmatization, improving understanding is massively important. And as we'll talk about with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it can be a invisible disability. And I think there's a perception that some people are aware of what's called fetal alcohol syndrome, which is the one where you might see some physical differences. So yeah, I know you've worked with somebody with fetal alcohol spectrum was it FAS or was it fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
It was FAS.
It was FAS. So fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yeah, that's okay. It. So again, a lot of the key characteristics, if you put in FAS in Google, a lot of the person I was supporting had those, but there's some slight differences. So it's a really difficult thing. But going back like 10 to 12 years, that wasn't even spoken about. It was just that this person has needs, social care needs, and we just got to support. But I didn't know anything about the condition whatsoever, or what it entailed, or how my support could have been tailored better to suit this individual.
Yeah, definitely. So I think maybe a good starting point then is, as you said, it wasn't something that was kind of recognised or spoken about when you were working with this individual. So was it in his care plan as far as written that he had that, or was it something you found out later?
So I'll be completely honest, when I first started working with him, it wasn't in his care plan. And then it was incorporated into his care plan because they said some of his behaviours were related to the condition or syndrome syndrome. And even then offered no sort of training on it, didn't really know what it was. I Googled it, and I'll be completely upfront, what I got from that was, it's when somebody's brain doesn't develop properly because mother has drank through pregnancy. And it was so black and white that that's what I thought it was. But how he behaved, or there were certain behaviours like repetitive behaviours and things like that, I didn't know that they were associated with the syndrome. So it was difficult.
There's a lot of people out there with potentially with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that there are easier diagnoses to get, so autism being one of them, and there is some similarities, or you could have that comorbidity if they're autistic and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So well, first off, it might be worth talking about what it is. So there's a condition called, or situation called prenatal alcohol exposure, and you kind of mentioned it there when you said you'd Googled it, is that it is where alcohol has been consumed during pregnancy. Now, this is one of the things that, again, there's a stigma around it because that immediately insinuates, or I think people associate that with, well, they must have been an alcoholic, or they must have been binge drinking and not being a good parent. But I know that there is people who were pregnant. I remember the time when they used to get encouraged to drink a glass of Guinness when they were pregnant because of the iron consumption in it. So one of the things I think is worth addressing is that, as far as research shows, there doesn't seem to be a safe level of alcohol.
Not nowadays, is that? I know my mum used to say, I used to have a fag on in a glass of Lambrini with you and you turned out all right, and that kind of stuff. But nowadays, it's just, that's what they say, not for pregnant.
I think it's it isn't the amount of alcohol. So I think when people talk about within a foster care community, particularly things like substance misuse and things like that. So, you kind of babies that have been born to mothers who are on heroin or on crack or cocaine and those sorts of things. I think most people think they're going to be severe. There's the kind of the adage, isn't it, the crack baby kind of thing. But actually alcohol, much more readily available, is potentially more detrimental to a fetus and the fetal development than most of the other substances. So alcohol is basically what's called and I'll try and pronounce it right, teratogen. Teratogen is a particular substance that impacts on the fetal development. And there's a few other things, not just alcohol, things like rubella and chickenpox and certain other illnesses can release teratogen.
I know about this. It impacts on a particular protein inside your brain that we need to be able to learn. It's all about the learning side of things, and I don't know what that protein's called, so I won't even attempt to do it. No. But that's what the T word impacts on. It impacts on that particular protein and things like that as well. Yeah.
So I know that so there's a few different conditions out there. So you've got when we're talking about a spectrum, so fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it covers a number of different kind of conditions within it. And you mentioned there as far as fetal alcohol syndrome. And fetal alcohol syndrome is typically when alcohol's been consumed in the first trimester. And in first trimester, that's where it seems to affect the physical development of the infant more so. So typically that's where you get the often it's a smaller head because of reduced brain size, but also other factors related to a common one is difference in earlobes, differences in the eye positions or distance between the eyes and the width of the eyes. But also one of the common ones that people are aware of is the flat top lip and a small lip on the top there. So they don't have the same angel bow, which is a term as far as their philtrum's concerned. But then there is numerous other conditions under that kind of that bracket as well of partial fetal alcohol syndrome, which obviously shows some of the signs, but not as many. It's not as clear cut. And then you've got kind of a broader bracket of neurodevelopmental disorders caused by perinatal alcohol exposure. And that kind of covers quite a broad array of almost invisible disabilities. So you don't have any of the physical differences, but it does seem to, it affects the central nervous system. It still affects the way the brain has developed and the way the brain grows. So, as far as we've got some details and we pulled up some information as far as there's a few different areas of the brain that it can affect. So it can, there's an area of the brain, this is where the geeky bit comes in, but the corpus callosum is the bit down the middle of the brain where the information passes between the left and right hemisphere. And that can be thin in those with fetal alcohol syndrome or spectrum disorder. Difficulty in movement, so areas affecting the cerebellum, the basal ganglia as well, which is associated with those with ADHD and Tourette's, which is associated with movement, so that can also be affected. And then your favourite lobe.
Am I ever going to live this one down?
No. So just so those of you who haven't watched this before, Nadine once said, was talking about the brain and said her favourite lobe was the frontal lobe. So that's an ongoing joke now because not many people have a favourite lobe. But Nadine does.
It's still my favourite as well.
It's still your favourite lobe. Yeah. Favourite meal, favourite colour, favourite lobe. Well,
what's your favourite lobe?
Yeah, add it into your any dates or on your Tinder profile. Make sure you put that out there. Favourite lobe is.
Take that out there. I don't want people messaging me.
What's your favourite lobe, love? Yeah. Okay, so as far as talking about some of the differences, well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think I completely understand why we had a couple of people who are interested in coming in and talking about children, either they're adopting, fostering, or have adopted, about fetal alcohol syndrome and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But I found it quite difficult to get them engaged. I think there's a nervousness about it. And I think part of it is, especially if it was a biological mother, it'd be an element of the stigmatization around it, that, what it says about them and the guilt. And that's why quite a lot of kids don't get diagnosed as well with the invisible variation, because unless there is the physical differences, the diagnosis is really difficult to get because it requires the mum to admit they were consuming alcohol during pregnancy.
That's it. I did go on a few FAS forums and stuff. Like I did a bit of research into what people with children with FAS were actually feeling when we couldn't get anybody on the podcast. And it is the general feeling that I've done something really bad. Yeah. I look like a terrible human. But I'd even read one article where a lady was really upset. You could see it in the way that she wrote it. She's like, people think I'm a bad parent, I'm a horrible mother. She says, I didn't know I was pregnant and I just went out partying and I only found out when I was 8 months, and by then the damage had kind of been done a little bit. So yeah, when I read those, obviously my understanding's got better as years have gone on, but it gave me more of an extra understanding there that, you know, yes, there is people out there that will drink knowing that they're pregnant.
So as far as referring to getting people with lived experience, as we said, there's, I think it's very difficult for a biological mother who's later on gets that diagnosis for a child of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or whichever other variation it is, because it's that stigmatization. But I think even there is people in my life that I know that have children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders or FAS, and even though they're adopted parents or foster carers, I think there's also an exposing the child. I think people are maybe more willing to talk about something like ADHD and autism, whereas that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is still, maybe it's because it's commonly misunderstood or it's got a higher level of stigma around it, that they're conscious about anybody knowing about their child having it, which I completely understand.
Yeah, it's not spoken about as much as some of the other conditions that you've mentioned. And I do wonder why. And again, I think it might be because we don't want to perceive there's something wrong with our child and those sorts of things. But yeah, there is a lot of stigma around it. And you know, I'll hold my hands up. I was one of those people probably 12 years ago, but Yeah, definitely.
So I think it was maybe just touching on a few bits of so how does it affect? How does it impact on a person? So it is commonly a learning disability. So it does impact on their intelligence quota as well as their ability to learn new skills. And I think that's one of the things that's worthwhile kind of understanding about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, because it affects the way they learn. It doesn't mean that they can't learn, they just have to learn in a different way, or the expectations for them has to be met. There's a really interesting diagram that or a chart that I often show in a lot of the courses, and I know you've used it as well. So this particular diagram kind of gives the breakdown in different cognitive areas for an 18-year-old with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it kind of outlines as far as they're 18 chronologically, but their communication age is, well, receptive communication, understanding and memory is sitting more about the age of 11. Even though they're expressive communication is actually sitting up at a higher level, like the age of 20. So that's causes some confusion, because they can sound, or this individual, for example, in this particular circumstance, will potentially sound quite together, quite with it, like a high level of kind of understanding because of language. And there's an assumption we make, isn't there, that somebody who can talk well is immediately perceived to be intelligent. But then, so if somebody sounds 20 and speaks in a very mature way, then people then try and speak to them in that same mature way, but their receptive understanding was sitting around, say, 11, 12, 13, which means that's not going to work for them. I think it had social skills sitting at the age of 7. It had emotional control sitting around the age of 6. And there's a lot of different conditions that we teach about and talk about that affects in a similar way within child settings, whether it be developmental trauma or ADHD or autism, where there is a difference in how well the brain effectively works or the skills in that particular area. But the problem is, for that 18-year-old, society is going to see them as an 18-year-old, especially if there's no physical differences or anything like that. So suddenly the expectations that they should be able to do this, should be able to do that, should be able to do the other, or they're not going to meet. And because they can't meet that, that's going to impact on their self-esteem and their progression and how they're perceived as an individual and those sorts of things. And that's where it's a shame in some ways that, you know, there isn't more awareness about, you know, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and how it affects the individual, because they may be perceived as just a bad person rather than just a case of they've got a learning disability. There was a statistic I read one time, and I sometimes refer to it, and I never remember whether I've got it right, but they do believe that a significant proportion of the American prison population would potentially get the diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So a high percentage of individuals in prisons aren't bad, they've potentially got a learning disability or a learning difference. And I think that's really sad in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a hard one because, like you said, a lot of kids don't get diagnosed till they're a bit older. And I think it's parents or carers or whoever it may be searching for an answer to particular behaviours or the way that they present. But just from my experience, FAS is really difficult. Like the person that I looked after, like, I know we mentioned some facial features and things like that. You wouldn't have noticed.
No. I say if it's only that FASD you'd notice, and actually quite a lot of the features, by the time they're 7, most kids are kind of grown out of those features as well.
Yeah,
so they're not as obvious. They don't meet the same, they're harder to recognize, harder to pick up on.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder affects is memory. So both it can be short-term and long-term memory as well. So obviously short-term memory can be things like your working memory and those sorts of things, as far as, forgetting the last thing a person told you to do, which might mean they come across like they're being disobedient or not following instructions properly, because it might be because they didn't remember it all. The other one is a long-term memory, or it affects their memory. So one of the things is that they often misremember, which is a term called confabulation. And I believe you've come across confabulation a number of times in your career, haven't you? And it happens in dementia as well as other conditions as well. So do you want to expand on what that is a little bit?
Yeah, so the way it's perceived is that somebody's lying about something. So they make something up and they're just making an outright lie. But when we have conditions alongside it, it's their perception of something that's actually going on. So that's where it gets a little bit difficult, because, again, alongside a learning disability, perception is different. So we do know that anyway. Again, other conditions have that same effect. So their perception of a situation. Now, I'll give you an example. The person I work with, a staff member had their phone on the side, and this person picked the phone up. And he was like, oh, this is mine now because you've left it there. And he just made up this big scenario and a bit of a story about how the phone now belonged to them because it wasn't anybody else's, and a little bit of a background story with it as well. So this is mine and I lost one ages ago. Yeah. And the staff member was like, I know it's my phone. Please, may I have my phone back? Yeah. Eventually got it through humour and things like that. But we had a big, massive story and scenario to go along with it. So, yeah.
So that kind of covers another little bit, which I know is something that affects another area. So that's kind of got some confabulation in there. The one I use for confabulation is if you imagine that I moved something from one side of the room to the other, but then I didn't remember moving it. Well, then how did it move? Things don't move by themselves. So my brain then is automatically going to work out, well, somebody must have moved it. And if I don't remember doing it, it must have been somebody else. And this is where you get, and I know like conditions like Korsakoff syndrome is quite common where this happens, where they'll come out of the room and go, who's been in my room? And it's because they've moved their stuff, but they don't remember moving it. So the brain makes up the story. Well, somebody else must have moved it.
I mean, I think we all do it to a certain extent.
Oh, we do blame others for if you don't remember something. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I think that's, again, is sort of it's considered to be lying. Or the assumption is that they're lying and they're doing it to be purposely deceitful.
Yeah, of course.
Whereas it's a misremembering of the actual circumstances.
Yeah.
So again, it's one of those labels that gets thrown around, or if it isn't recognised, it's going to be picked up as they're being naughty or a bad kid, or they're lying, rather than it's not their fault. It's something their brain does. They're doing the best they can. Mm-hmm. The other bit that you mentioned in there is the concept of ownership, and I've come across that. So ownership's quite an abstract concept. And one thing that some individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder struggle with is abstract concepts. So don't touch things that don't belong to you. Okay, that's an abstract phrase. It's not a concrete phrase, because it's all about imagining that an item is belonging to somebody else and therefore you mustn't touch it. So when I'm talking about this, I kind of raise it in what is ownership. Well, and you gave the phone as a really good example, actually. I often use my phone. So if I left the room and I left my phone on the table, would you still know that phone was mine?
No,
and how would you know it is my phone? Absolutely. But that's it. It's because it's got my details on it. It's got my texts on it. It's previously mine. I potentially have the receipt somewhere for it and those sorts of things. But if you look at a concrete concept of ownership, is I have it. Is that ownership is, possession is 9/10 of the law kind of thing. But that's a concrete concept of ownership, that if I have it in my hand, then surely it's me that owns it. So that could be a difficult concept for individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder to understand, because of that abstract concept of, so who owns something on the shop shelf? And it maybe struggles. So this is a thing that I came across, situation that happened. So we're in a supermarket, and we were just about to kind of leave, and this lad had a ball in his hand. And it was a case of, you can't just leave the supermarket out. Where did you get that from? And his response was, I found it. We found it in a supermarket. So it was probably stock. It wasn't just randomly. But if you put that into a different context, if we were down the park and we found a football and there was nobody else around, what would we say? Oh, look, we found a football. So what had happened is that all the other footballs had been in one particular space, but this one football had been on a different shelf, had been in a different place. So more than likely, another mum had stopped a kid from nicking a football and just not put it back properly, just put it back somewhere. So straight away, you can understand why he didn't connect that ball is the same as those balls, and therefore that ownership. And I found it. It wasn't with other balls. It wasn't anybody else around who claimed it, and therefore it was mine. So one of the things that we had to do is, with one situation, is that anything that was theirs, we put their name on it. Because then we can have a concrete concept of ownership, being like, is that yours? I don't know. Is your name on it? And therefore, if his name wasn't on it, then it wasn't his.
Yeah, see, my person, they had a key to their bedroom door because we had a lot of the same situations and things going missing or accusations and all that sort of stuff. So he had a key and nobody else had the key but him, not even staff members. It was low level of support. So that made him feel so much better.
Yeah, because he then didn't have the reason to think anybody else has been in my bedroom.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So with the, so some of the other condition and factors that seem to affect then the impaired executive functioning, so that's that frontal lobe bit of the brain, favorite lobe, where they struggle with planning, problem solving, and impulse control. So if we take the impulse control as an example, there's two that you kind of counter for this. So one is impulse control. I think we might have spoken about on podcast before, but the Stroop test. You aware of the Stroop test?
Do you know what? My frontal lobe can't remember.
That'd be your hippocampus, for your temporal lobe. But the Stroop test, I know we've spoken about it, and I think you've done it in some courses.
Yeah.
But where you have lots of names of colours written on a piece of paper, and sometimes the colour of the font or the colour of the ink matches the word, and sometimes then on a different version of the test, then the word and font don't match. So it says red, but the colour of the font is green. And
it boggles your mind, that one.
It does, yeah. And what you do is you get people to basically read out loud, not saying the word, but naming the colour of the font. And when it says red and is red, they get through that very, very quickly. But when it says red but is green, and they're meant to be naming that it is green, their brain tries to read red first. Then they have to inhibit themselves and then say what they're meant to be saying. So it slows them right down. And most people take about 3 times as long to read through this list of words than it does when they're matching. And that's an example of what's called the Stroop test. And that's an example of that executive functioning. Your inhibition part of the brain being able to go, no, that's not what we're doing right now, stop, and then readdress itself. So that's kind of what they call cold executive functionings. Then you've got what we call hot executive functionings. And a good example of that is the marshmallow test, which is where children are sat in front of a marshmallow. They're told they can eat it straight away, or if they wait till the experimenter comes back, or if they ring a bell, then somebody will come in and they can have 2 marshmallows, as long as it's over a certain time. And the kids, some kids are able to delay that gratification and they wait for the 2. But it'd be very common for a kid with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder to just eat that marshmallow straight away. Why delay when I can have that now? I can't even hold on to that concept of what's coming in the future. So that impulse control but that looks nice. I need to eat it. So again, that's going to, as far as some of these, you can see why naughty kids would get these kind of these stigmatization or judgments around them, but is it something else going on, whether it be ADHD or FAS or whatever the condition is? There is some sensory difference as well. So sensory issues. Now, obviously, we've done loads of podcasts on sensory. So I'd encourage anybody to go back and look at some of the other videos we've done, particularly around the one on sensory processing in autism, because there is a lot of crossover. So many individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Did your guy have any sensory issues?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
It's hard to tell from way back then, but no, not that I'm aware of.
No. Okay. So continuing on with the kind of symptoms then, And one of the things they also seem to struggle with is picking up on social cues, which again is that where it falls into the autistic kind of spectrum of difficulty with social communication, theory of mind, social imagination, when it may all be a little bit more difficult to them. One of the big things with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, I think, that then runs through life, and it's similar to what we've spoken about on some of the other podcasts, and whether it be ADHD, but also with the substance misuse, is often they self-medicate. So there's a lot of mental health issues associated with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. There are also difference in the neurotransmitters as well, so their ability to regulate, so anxiety, depression and stuff. Not only do they, because of the differences they have, they might find they're more predisposed, but there's actually a biological difference that predisposes them for those conditions as well. And also there seems to be that high vulnerability of addictive nature as well, and that impulse control, so all tying together to cause problems with then drugs, alcohol and stuff. So you can see where that high level of incarceration with those with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is going to come into play.
Addiction's a really big thing, isn't it? So again, my person, it was gambling.
Right.
So what I've read from it and what I've looked up, it's the addiction side because of those neurotransmitters, and that dopamine is a really, really big one juicy hit.
Yeah.
And we want to keep going back for that hit and those sorts of things. But then with the FASD, it's the social construct after, isn't it? So gambling, I've got 30 quid, I'm a bit skint and I've got no more money to last me for the rest of the week. But I understand that if I go spend all that money, it's the decisions and it's choices, consequences. Maybe somebody sometimes, this just from my own personal experience with Baz, wouldn't think about the consequences at that time. It's just that rush to get that addiction fed. So that kind of that rush a little bit. But I think it's the addiction side that's a really big part, and then leads on to everything else like mental health and stuff like that. Yeah,
definitely. I think what you said there was interesting as well related to the gambling is that so money, if we talk about the abstract concepts again, it's one I tend to refer to as well when I'm teaching about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, is that money is an abstract concept. It's quite complex, and you ask any very young child, would you prefer £1 or 5 20p's? And most would say they want the 5 20p's, because at a young age, it's that concept of, well, there's 5 of them, so that's more. And that's quite a simple concept related to money. So if you've got a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, for instance, let's say that you've got some sweets and I really want those sweets. Well, what have I got to offer you? Oh, I'll give you a mobile phone for a sweet. Because there's a concept of almost it's one for one. I give you one, you give me one. Not necessarily understanding the full concept that that's worth hundreds of sweets, let alone kind of just the one. And there's also that impulse control, but I want a sweet now. So that's worth more to me than the mobile phone is, and they can't then delay that gratification again, if that makes sense. Again, so this makes them extremely vulnerable from a kind of a social construct point of view, or social interactions, that it'd be easy to manipulate somebody who has that concept of materialistic items of the one for one, that if I give you this, you give me that, even though what they're giving is worth way more. And probably ties into the gambling a little bit, doesn't it? Not really understanding the concept of what £30 is, that it's just, it's gone, it's there, or it's not. It's not I could save a bit of it, or I could save a $5's worth of it, as well as the impulse control and that desire for the kind of the dopamine here as well. So one of the things, again, another potential misdiagnosis or dual diagnosis, many individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder do also struggle with attention deficit and also hyperregulation or hyperactivity and those sorts of things. So whether it be regulating their emotions, or whether it be regulating their movement, or keeping focused on one particular task, they all kind of tie in as well. So again, you've got all of these magnitude of different factors that are going to impact on their academic abilities. So that's why it's kind of not a learning disability into itself. It has a knock-on effect to all these different kind of symptoms that kind of affect their learning. I think I know that some friends and family who've had children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder have found it extremely challenging. And I think there's many adoptive parents out there that obviously they may not know when they adopt the baby and things like that there is that condition, is a vulnerability, is a risk, and then how much that impacts on this child's day-to-day life and how they see the world. And that's one of the things that we do around the behavioural management side to try and help people with that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if we take some of those ideas, I think one of the things that is worth touching on, and kind of as we're talking about this condition and drawing the podcast to a close and things like that, is first off, what doesn't work. So a lot of the typical behavioural strategies that people utilise to manage behaviours, particularly in children, don't work with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I've given you one example there. So pocket money, for instance, if they don't understand the concept of money in that way that we do, well, pocket money is not going to be a worthwhile kind of way of adjusting behavior, is it? Because why would I do that I don't enjoy for one of them, or for that money? It doesn't drive me. It doesn't kind of, or I may not understand the concept of what I can get with that money and how much it's worth. So that's not going to be the best kind of strategy. I know we talk a lot in a lot of the different courses of moving away from the punishment reward. So we talked about it in lots of different podcasts, but the punishment reward kind of principle, that you do something good, you get something good, you do something bad, there's a consequence. And many parents out there have used things like star charts as an example of that, of a way of rewarding. If we've got that memory deficit, for instance, or the impulse control, I may love the star I get on Monday. That isn't going to change what I do on Tuesday. It isn't going to influence my behavior. So again, this is where, but we keep doing this, we keep trying this, we keep putting this in place, and it doesn't seem to be improving things, then the feeling is that that's the child's fault. They're not learning. They're not changing their behavior, even though we're trying to reward them or punish them and stuff like that. I think it is that thing, isn't it? As I've probably said numerous times, Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But if you don't have any other way of doing it, or don't understand any other way of doing it, then it's going to feel like banging your head against a brick wall. So, so one of the things that I know works better for individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is repetition. It's got to keep happening over and over again in the same way. It's that consistency and repeated recognition, reinforcement, support over a period of time.
With the person I was obviously supporting, there was a big, I won't say anxiety, but there was a bit like, who's coming on tonight, who's here tomorrow. They wanted a step-by-step plan of who was coming and what days were what. So their work days were set days, they never ever changed. Everything was completely the same all the time. And I won't say like a routine, like they could have been flexible in their routine, but it was more about if something had to change on the spot, pretty much okay with that. The change didn't upset them too much, but it was the knowing in advance and having that particular routine and stuff like that worked really well for them.
Yeah. Well, there's an acronym that's used that's come from the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder community, which is called SCREAMS. And SCREAMS is about kind of not you screaming at them or them screaming. It's about no scream parenting or no shout parenting, which is similar to the philosophies that we use in therapeutic parenting and we teach across the able target system and stuff like that anyway. So the S in SCREAM stands for structure. So what you were mentioning there and talking about your client is massive. So routines, boundaries, really important. But also, like I gave the example there of the ownership thing, there's structure too, putting in concrete concepts of the rules or communication or situational and things like that, really important to kind of do. So you're working to their abilities rather than expecting them to work to yours.
Yeah, our general rule was, because there was other tenants in that house as well, so there was 4 people altogether. If you've not bought it, it's not yours. And it was like a house rule that we had. I mean, it wasn't one that we had to enforce, but it was a case of if this particular client picked something up, we'd say, hang on a minute, whose is that? And they said, no, it's that. We used humour quite a lot, and that worked really well, but it was also a gentle reminder that please don't pick that up because that isn't yours. And it worked really well.
That's it, you're giving that concrete concept, isn't it? That if you didn't buy it, then it isn't yours. It's quite a simple, concrete concept of ownership again, to make it simplified. So it's one that's quite adaptable because you can't necessarily go around putting his name on everything in his house for an adult as well.
And other people didn't want their names on things. They just wanted people to know it belonged to them.
Leave it alone. 100%. The other one is, it mentions, so the C in screams is cues, and cues is they will need constant ongoing prompts. Similar to what we teach in ADHD as far as, don't just set them a task and expect them to complete it. You might need to keep helping. I think one of the frustrating things for many parents or many adults is we sometimes set the time frame of how long we think a person should have learned something by.
Yeah.
We've done this 15 times by now. You should know how to do it. But that may not be the case. You can't dictate that for a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. It may take hundreds of times before they get it. It doesn't mean you give up on it. It just means we keep going, keep prompting, keep cueing, and helping, as you said, like visual timetables. I think you mentioned, and things like that for the individual, so he knew who was coming in.
Again, it was starting a task. That was the biggest. I won't say challenge, but that was the hardest part. So it was the beginning of something, and once they got into their rhythm of doing it, it was like, all right, leave me alone, I can do it, and that was good. But we'd just check in, and then take as long as you need to. But then we'd have to remind them to stop for maybe lunch and things like that, or it's so-and-so's turn to use the Hoover now, and that could sometimes cause a bit of, well, you've told me to do something and I'm doing it, and so it was just gentle. So
again, the concrete concept, isn't it?
But to end a task, we had to move on to another one, so we had to make sure we had a task ready. So can you stop Hoover in your bedroom because it's time to go make your lunch? The staff are here to help you do that. So that's what we did.
Now, it sounded quite interesting. Obviously, the guy you were working with, even though he was in supported living, he worked.
He loved it. It was his purpose. Well, it is his purpose. So something that he was really interested in. By all accounts, from past history, I'd always been interested in doing this thing that he was doing.
Yeah, what was the job that he was doing?
Gardening. Right, so agriculture work. Yeah, nice. But when he went there, he was surrounded by people with other disabilities as well, and he made lots of friends there. He was so independent. He would get himself up to go catch the bus. This was something that was really, really important to him. So he caught the bus there, but I think it was 3 days a week. 3 days a week he did that. But really, really enjoyed it, and paid bills, cooked for himself, just needed some support, prompting, assistance and stuff, but had a lovely girlfriend and had nice dates and things like that. So he leads a very, as far as I'm still concerned now, he leads a very good life, which is nice.
Oh, that's nice to hear, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I take it the employer was a kind of a specialist employer that
So
made adaptations and adjustments and understood.
It's not slave labour or anything.
No. But also it's not a typical workplace that may have struggled with some of that.
It's an adapted workplace, which I think is absolutely amazing. So it's adapted to individuals' needs. Like they've all got care plans there and everything, but they're being paid to do work that they are capable of doing, and like they're able to do, and there's no limits there for them. Like they have a bit of a go at everything, and they've got support staff there as well. So really nice, and it's a work community. So he's got work friends, he's got online friends, he's got outside, he's got a whole community of different people.
Oh, that sounds really positive. Yeah. Were they doing food then? Was it kind of, when you say agriculture, it was growing stuff?
Yeah, so a bit of that, and then a bit of farm work and things like that. So it was like gardening / farm.
Did they go around to different places, or was it just one location?
Just one big, massive location in Leicestershire.
Okay. Yeah, they're worth looking out for, aren't they? As far as I know there is some forestry schools and those sorts of things, but I don't know about many around this particular area that does something. I'm sure there are.
Like I said, East Mids again.
We're East Mids.
You're not your Lincoln.
Okay, so to draw us a bit of a close as far as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, we would genuinely, we kind of seek out to anybody who's watching this, if you have some lived experience, you've got a family member or a loved one that is living with the condition, it'd be amazing to actually have some direct kind of conversations and learn more about. So please get in contact with us and let us know. I have been directed, and we're going to kind of look out on some of the forums and see if maybe we can kind of get somebody actively involved. But whether it be a parent of somebody supporting somebody with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and we'd love to hear about the challenges and the positives as well that come from working with that child. That'd be amazing to have you on. But hopefully you found today's podcast useful as far as a little bit of information about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, even if it's just to prompt you to go out and search some more and have a little bit more understanding around it, then that would be fantastic. All right. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Bye.